awesome artists. Welcome to Watercolor Technique. First, you can see I've got my setup. My paper is taped down. I have two things of water, my paint, and some napkins. The paper I buy is watercolor paper. I bought this at Walmart, and it says at the bottom 140 pound, and that is the weight of the paper. You can go as low as 90, but I wouldn't go any less than that. I only use 4 brushes. Here are my brushes. First, I buy soft bristles. This is made from natural hairs or fibers. And this one's called a flat wash. It's for coloring in large areas. My next two are size 10 round. I use these two for all the rest of my painting. They come to a nice point. That's what you want to look for in a brush when it's wet. Does it come to a point? I use 2 because I use one for painting and one for fading out paint. One's clean. My last brush is actually a nylon brush, and it's a size 4, and it's much stiffer. If you flick the bristles, they spring back. A natural hair one won't spring like that. So you can tell the difference between natural and nylon by the springiness of the brush. Anyway, it's just a cheap brush, and I use a smaller size for the detail. I have 2 containers of water. The bigger one I use for rinsing, and then the other one I use for putting clean water to activate the paints. When I rinse a brush, I make a figure 8 pattern and wipe the brush on the bottom. My clean water I will use to activate the paint and put more paint in. Now I'm using a really cheap set just so that you can see you can watercolor with just about anything. If you do become more advanced, you will want to invest in better watercolor paints, but this is like a crazy art set, very low cost, so that you can begin painting at any place. Now I'm activating my paint by squeezing a few drops of water into each color. This will activate, because these are pan sets, you would even need to do this with liquid watercolor, depending on what kind you get and the intensity of color you want. So starting with my color wash, I'm going to load my brush. It takes a few times to roll around, especially if you're using a pan set. You want to really roll your brush and activate the color. Color wash is simply a wash of color. You want to try to make it even. So I like to paint an outline of my shape, whatever I'm painting, and then you can see how you use the tip just to scribble it in. Maybe while it's still wet, you can add and make it the intensity of color that you want. And I kind of just scribble back and forth to even out my paints. Glazing is a technique where you add paint on top of a wash. We're not going to be able to see the glaze right now because we first have to establish a wash. I have to let this dry. Glazing does not work if the paint is wet. That's actually called wet in wet. So glazing, I will let that dry by put a wash down, and I will go back later. A variegated wash is just using 2 colors and letting them bleed into each other. I started with a real light color, yellow, made my figure 8 to rinse out my brush. Then I add another color. I'm painting blue here. Then when it touches, the colors start to naturally just mix together on their own. Now, if I wasn't on a table and I hadn't taped my painting to the table, I could just lift my painting. If I had taped it to cardboard or something, a board, I could lift that and let that bleed naturally. But I'm going to kind of stroke it in to help it to blend a little more. But I probably would have just lifted my board had I not taped this to my table. So I'm just letting the colors kind of blend together. My graded wash, I start with the full intensity of the color, so as much pigment as I can get down. Then I use my towel to dump off color. And then I paint again next to it. That wasn't enough. Dump off some more, twisting and rolling to get rid of some of that color. There we go. So there's less color. And then I paint next to it, and you can see it's lowering the intensity and fading out the color. When I get to the end of my graded color wash, what I'll actually do is dip in the water, dump off the water, and almost paint with just water, a little bit of pigment in my brush to make that as light as I can. So this is a value where we go from dark to light. The next technique is scraping. I'm just making a variegated wash here real quick. Scraping is a technique where you're actually scraping the paper, and the cool thing is on the back of your brush, on a lot of the brushes there's an angle, and that is a great tool. Now this looks like this paint is a staining paint and it's not going to scrape. Sometimes you can get white paper to show through, but this instead is more indenting the paper, and you can see that the paint fills in on the indents, and you can make these lines and things happen by indenting the paper. Sometimes it will scrape the paint right off if it's a non-staining paint, but this one's stained, and so therefore it's more of an indent. Wet and wet involves wetting your paper first. I'm using my clean water. I don't want dripping, soaking water. But when I look at my paper, it should be shimmering with water, not pooling with water, not soaking water or dripping or running off, just water. So I go ahead with a wash and put that in the wet. And what happens is the paint kind of just runs wherever there's water. There's a wash. And when things are nice and wet, you can drip in other colors and they'll spread, similar to tie-dye, just kind of they'll bleed out and just make kind of little fingery patterns. And you can do edges or paint in the middle. You can drop paint into paint and let it spread, and it's just a fun technique for, oops, should not have done that. Look what I did to my yellow. Rinse your brush, right? Anyway, different colors, drop it in and watch it spread when it's wet. Has to be wet, that's why the technique's called wet and wet. And I like to even put colors within colors, and once again, to me it just looks like tie-dye, kind of a fun pattern. Next we're using what's called masking fluid, and this is more of a specialty item that you need to find at an art store, not at Walmart. And it's kind of runny, it's very similar to rubber cement. If you have rubber cement, that is something you can buy at Walmart, but it's harder to use the rubber cement. It's not as fluid as the masking fluid. So this is easily painted on. You do want to work fast, and it dries pretty quickly, so you have to work pretty fast with the masking fluid, but it's a specialty item if you end up deciding to do that. One thing about the masking fluid is you have to let it dry completely before you can paint over the top of it, and the paper will show through when you're done. Next we have rubbing alcohol. I'm going to put down a wash. Now, rubbing alcohol is something you can buy at Walmart or wherever. It's just really readily available. I like to put it in a little container so it's easier to use. I use a brush usually to put it on. You can do dots, and you can see right away it pushes the paint around. You never know what you're going to get with rubbing alcohol, but that's how watercolor is. It's kind of an uncontrollable medium. It's just little bit wild and free. So rubbing alcohol is just one more effect you can use. Next, I'm using some masking tape, and you want to be careful. If you get super high-tack masking tape, it will rip your paper. Sometimes I will rub it on my jeans before putting it down on the watercolor paper if it's super high-tack. You can cut it into various shapes. I'm just going to make a nice little art tribute here with my masking tape. You can cut all sorts of shapes with the masking tape, anything you can think of, and then tape it on, and then you paint right over the top of it. When that's dry, you'll pull off the tape. The next technique is salt. And to begin with, all I'm doing is putting in a quick color wash. And salt, what I like to do is have it in a container that I can pinch it out. So here's my container. I like to take a pinch. A shaker is uncontrollable. I don't like that. I put it in a container and just sprinkle it on. What it will do is bleach out different areas. And here I have a crayon. This one just happens to be white. You can use colored crayons. They'll show up in various intensities based on what color you paint over the top of them. But crayon basically is a wax resist, pushing the paint away because wax and paint do not mix. Then when I paint over the top of the wax or the crayon, it pushes away and it shows up. It's kind of fun. For the plastic wrap, I begin with a color wash. Then I will take some plastic wrap and kind of crumple it into a shape, and I put tape on the back side and then tape it right over the top of the area I want to have plastic wrap. What it does is it pulls the paint and makes kind of little texture patterns. So plastic wrap is just another effect. Dry brush involves a brush that is dry. I spread out the bristles with my fingers. Then you kind of scrape in the paint and then scrape it on your paper, and you get a dry brush effect. It's just, you can kind of see the bristle lines, and it's definitely not a colored in like a color wash. It's just an effect over the top maybe of your painting. I actually use this when I'm painting flowers. I'll put a dry brush wash over the top, and it looks like there's veins on the flowers. And I'm putting down a color wash so that we can do the lift off technique. The lift off technique is just as it sounds. You're going to lift off paint, and you can actually activate paint with your brush, with a clean brush with just water, and then use a towel to lift off the paint. Splattering, I put my finger out and tap my brush and it can splatter, or you can flick your brushes down. It's pretty wild, uncontrollable, so it is a fun thing to do. And then the last thing, and I think this is an important technique to master, is the ability to make fine lines with your paint using just the tip. So just the very tip, I'm going to spell my name. This is a great control exercise. Can you control the paint and just use the tip? And actually when I'm painting, I'm never using much more than the first half of the brush. I never push down my brush hard enough that the metal touches the paper. So just something to think about. You're kind of using only the tip of the brush most of the time you're painting. When you're putting in a wash, maybe halfway down that brush you're pushing onto the paper, but most of the time it's just the tip you're using anyway. A handy tool for watercolor is a hair dryer, because a lot of times some of these techniques need completely dried out paint or the masking fluid before you can begin on the next step. So I actually did use my hair dryer to dry all of these so that I can show you what's next. Now, what I want to show you first is glazing. And this is going over the top. Now I'm using the exact same color, but look at the intensity. When I go over it again, it really brightens up that color. One thing you need to know about watercolor is it dries much lighter than when you first paint it. So glazing is a technique, and it's one of my favorites, to make the colors intense. I mentioned that I use two brushes, and I'm going to show you why in here. So I put a little bit of blue, and with a rinsed out brush, I'm fading that blue into this purple. This is how I shade things in my paintings, is by applying color with one brush and with a cleaned out brush, fading it into the other color. And that's, you can see on that corner there, that little bit of blue is kind of like a shadow. Right, now let's see what happened with our plastic wrap. Okay, you can see the texture as the paint pools around the plastic wrap. Now I'll pull off my masking tape, and you can see everything underneath is pretty well. Sometimes paint will get under some of the edges, and that's all right. But masking tape will create a white space, or whatever the color is underneath. And the last is my masking fluid, and that just rubs off. So I use my finger, or you can use something to rub it off. I just find my finger works really well. I rub off all of that fluid, and there I have the paper. You could paint first and then mask. Just make sure it is dry. When I rub the salt off, you can see that it has bleached areas. Darker colors bleach more, and the green area it's very light. It's hard to see. Now that you know some of the techniques, I hope you'll try out your own watercolor. It is so much fun. Have fun painting.